Well, I'm here talking with Dr. Guy Lonergan, who's with Texas Tech University, and we're at the NIAA conference that's focused on antibiotics and antibiotic resistance. And Dr. Lonergan, you had a really interesting presentation yesterday with Dr. Scott from Kansas State, where you did kind of a point-counterpoint discussion of some of the research into antibiotic resistance. And I wonder if you could just tell a little of how that worked and what some of your objectives were in that session.
So thank you. We had really two objectives in that session. First of all, we wanted to show that in the world of science as it relates to antimicrobial drug resistance, it's very complex and we don't have simple experiments that can be done. We rely on observational data and oftentimes retrospectively designed studies that look at observational data. And given that, assigning cause and effect is very challenging. And so what we tried to do was to illustrate that how data can be looked at through a narrow perspective and interpreted in two different ways, and sometimes two very different ways. So what we did to help get through that objective is we selected a few seminal papers, and we chose who was going to argue in the affirmative and who was going to be the devil's advocate. And we really tried to argue earnestly for our position to illustrate the challenges of interpreting complex data. And our second objective, which really led from the first one, was to say that if we just look at data from a very narrow perspective, then it builds conflict about what is the role of antibiotics in use in animal production and public health outcomes. And then if we really want to try and find a solution, then we have to start looking at a broad suite of perspectives to better understand how we might frame solutions.
I wonder if you could talk a little about maybe one or two of the studies that you discussed in that session, and maybe how they might be interpreted, either pro or con.
So we looked at a number of papers, specifically related to Salmonella were some of them. And so we looked at a seminal paper by Dutil from Canada that looked at an intervention that stopped using intra-ovo use of antimicrobial in the poult raising industry, where they saw a reduction of antimicrobial resistance in the human population. And we argued for that as being this is a regional intervention and it shows a dramatic response. We argued against it because some of the interventions were very qualitative and not well described, and some of the other actions and how that interpretation may be somewhat tenuous. We also looked at another suite of intervention papers, particularly regional associations, and there were some by Alison Mather. And so we argued for that as looking at Salmonella as two distinct populations, in cattle or in people, and then we argued against that as well. And then we also went through one of the most famous or infamous interventions, that would be the Denmark experience. And so we argued as convincingly as we thought for it, and then we argued as convincingly as we thought we could against it. And so I think it was a fun experience for us, but hopefully informative for the audience, because it illustrated the challenges of interpreting very complex data.